This line is so important that it's been described as the most unsettling line in American politics. Now, I'm stealing Martin Gillen's word for a bit of dramatic effect here. But what is this line? Well, this line tells you exactly how responsive policy is to people's preferences. So on the x-axis here, we have the degree to which a proportion of the population supports a policy. So percentage of support. On the y-axis here, we have probability that that policy is going to be adopted by policymakers. So probability policy adopted. So this line tells us something about responsiveness to people's preferences. Now, this is the line for an average voter in Gillen's words. So these are middle income folks, sort of the median voter, if you like, or the medium income earner. Towards this end of the chart, we'll see that, well, we've got pretty low levels of support for a policy in this particular population. So we're talking about middle income voters. So in this area, not a lot of people, not a lot of middle income people are voting for this policy, or at least have preferences for it, are supportive of it. Towards this end of the scale, we've got lots of support inside middle income voters for a particular policy. However, regardless of whether middle income voters love this policy or hate it, the probability that the policy is going to be adopted is around 30%. Policy is not responsive to the preferences of middle income voters. Now, this is really the sort of the highlight, or the most important finding that came out of Martin Gillen's 10 years worth of research on political inequality. Regardless of whether a policy is loved or despised, it has pretty much the same chance of being adopted by the government, around 30%. Not so good when we're thinking about democratic politics. So we've seen this interesting result that Gillen's came to, this kind of non-responsive result. So it might be worth just thinking a little bit about how he got there, sort of what was the methodology of this huge research effort. So there were lots and lots of survey questions, around 2,000 of them, I think, and the surveys that the researchers went out with covered 3-decade period. So it was a huge research project, and the types of questions that they asked people were all sorts of things on all sorts of different policy. Now, we'll be focusing on sort of the economic and social questions in particular, but if you do dig into the book, it is a little bit old now, but I think the themes kind of stack up. So the questions were covering all sorts of issues, and here just a flavour of them: abortion, taxes, gun control, foreign military engagement, so all different types of policy questions. This is what the survey tried to capture, people's opinions on these policy issues. Now, another neat thing about this particular piece of research is that Gillen's not only collected people's perceptions on things, their support or opposition to certain policy changes, he also collected their income status. So what was to which income group did the respondents belong? And so we have, which we've kind of seen already, what were the sort of preferences or the degree of support for folks in the bottom end of the income distribution, those with middle income, so what we've just seen, and the top income earners. So these are kind of what we call the elites. There's also another interesting measure, and so this is essentially trying to capture the sum of, or kind of a net interest group measure of preferences. And this, because it's an American study, we're talking about interest groups in Washington. So what this is really trying to measure, as I said, it's kind of like the sum of groups that favour or oppose a certain policy change, or a kind of aggregation or the relative balance of interest group preferences here. So what the data is telling us is something about the distribution of views, whether people support or oppose certain policy change, and the extent to which policy preferences converge or diverge across these different income groups. So it's pretty neat. And finally, we have a measure of actually whether policy was adopted or not. So the types of policies that the questions are based on. And so we have a measure of whether the policy was adopted and within 4 years following the survey. So what this allowed Gillens to do was to measure the influence of these different actors in ways that we really hadn't been able to do, at least without much precision before. So we're looking at the degree to which preferences across these income groups actually show up in policy, whether they're, whether these policies actually are represented in the policies that are adopted within the 4-year period that we're talking about. So I've got a little 3-minute task for you. And so we've seen the line for the average middle income citizen. And so now I want you to think about what this line looks like for the 2 other groups. So for the elite groups, so think about these folks as top income earners, say the top 10%. And another line for the interest group, or that sort of net interest group. So think about what these 2 lines for these 2 groups would look like. So pause the video, give yourself 3 minutes or so to think about this, and then we will run through it. Right, so let's think about what this line looks like for elites. Now, according to the results, it looks something like this. How about for special interest groups or interest groups, the net sort of net effect of interest groups? Well, this looks something like this. So interest groups here and elites here. Now, what is this really saying? Okay, well, it's telling us very simply that when percentage of support of elites is very low, and likewise interest groups, so when policies are not supported by elites or by interest groups, these sorts of policies have a very low probability of being adopted. Those that have significant support, however, so in the case of interest groups, this is where most interest groups are in favour of the policy, and those groups far outweigh those who oppose it. So this is the kind of net idea again. So when there is high support, or when the interest groups in Washington far outweigh, in support of that policy, far outweigh those who don't like it, then the probability of the policy being adopted is high. And again, this is the same for elites. So when the proportion of elites favouring a policy is high, again, there is a much higher probability that the policy is adopted. Interesting, the sort of shape of this curve, and I'll leave you to think about that and kind of compare it with your own thoughts or expectations of how that looks. But this is what the data that Gillens presents looks like. Actually, it's probably worth mentioning that the probability for these folks is still pretty low, so the scale is a bit off. The scale should probably look a lot more like this. So I think, here we're still only looking at sort of 60%-ish. And I guess this speaks in part that the idea that voting decisions are much more than translations of policy preferences, and that we have other motivations for voting people into power. But the difference across income groups, even when policy does change, is I think it's still pretty stark between these income groups, even though we're sort of thinking about policy doesn't really change all that readily. But yeah, the kind of difference across income groups is notable. Now it's probably worth just being clear here that the differences in responsiveness that we're looking at only matter when preferences between the income groups differ. Now, of course, if preferences across the income groups were the same, then responsiveness would also be the same. So regardless of income group, if these preferences were the same, we would see the same level of responsiveness. So this kind of lack of responsiveness is only important when we see preferences between the income groups diverge. And so what we've got here, so what the data is telling us here is that when the proportion of people supporting a policy differs across income groups, the difference in responsiveness is pretty clear to see. So here we've got the 50th percentile, so the sort of middle income, median income earners here, and the 10th percentile, so the lowest income earners. And you can see that really there's not too much of a difference here. We're both kind of in both cases, you're looking at about 30% responsiveness rate, regardless of the level of support that the policy change has within these different income groups. So again, this is sort of replicating the dangerous line that we saw just now. We can see that, again, just kind of reiterating what we've just talked about, when it comes to elites, so the 90th percentile, obviously what this tells us is that when elites really don't like a policy, it's very unlikely that it's going to be adopted. When elites like a policy, it's much more likely, or at least there's a higher chance that it's going to be adopted. And I say higher because, again, we're kind of seeing this status quo bias here in that, policy doesn't really change all that frequently. But this is an important point to remember that, when we're talking about difference in responsiveness, it only applies to policies on which there is a diversion in preferences across the income groups. And perhaps another quite interesting finding from the study is that actually preferences across income groups don't vary all that much on many of the issues that are investigated. There are some issues on which preferences do tend to diverge more than others, and redistribution is one of those issues. So I just wanted to show you this, which again comes from the book here, to really focus in on some of the the key types of economic and redistribution issues that we might be interested in. So do preferences differ across income groups with regards to these important redistribution type questions? Well, this sort of tells us that yes, they do. Cut top marginal tax rates. The 10th percentile, so the lowest income group here, not really that interested. It's kind of same sort of indifference between whether this is supported or not. For the 50th, so these are the middle income earners, they quite like the idea. So they're quite in support of it to cut top marginal tax rates. But the elites say, yes, please, we want top marginal tax rates to be cut. And so again, thinking about the kind of sum of the difference between the bottom end and the top end of the income distribution, the higher this number, well, in either direction, the greater that is the gap between preferences or support across the income groups. So again, big ones we've got here: cut capital gains tax. Again, lowest so people in the lower end of the income distribution, not too bothered, pretty indifferent. And this really ramps up when we get to the elite group. So these elite folks definitely want capital gains taxes to be cut. And we can think about the reasons for that. So, if we're thinking about passing on wealth, property, assets, this is going to be important for the elites. And then again, kind of coming down the bottom here, looking at these negatives. So raise minimum wage. Seems intuitive, the lowest end of the income distribution really loving this idea that they want to raise the minimum wage. Interestingly, also got a lot of support within the middle income earners here. And again, we do see support for the policy idea or the policy change in the elite group, but far less than we do see that reflected for the lower income folks. So this just gives a flavour of the differences in preferences across the income groups for issues related to redistribution. So this evidence is all very nice, and it kind of gives us an intuitive picture of how we might expect sort of policy to be responding to our own individual preferences. But it does fly in the face a little bit of this folk theory of democracy that all our votes are counted equally. But I guess if we just look at this particular piece of research, we might say, well, it could be actually something to do with the peculiarities of the US political system. So we want to have a look at and see what data there might be from other countries to see if this tends actually to be endemic of affluent societies more generally. And this is what Larry Bartels tries to do. So he's looking at social spending preferences in lots of different countries around the world. And again, it's sort of a survey type study conducted between sometime in the 80s and 2012 with about 30 countries, including most of those in Western Europe, but also some of the newer democracies in Eastern Europe, Latin America and Asia. So the kind of country case studies expanded significantly, and there are obviously methodological problems that come with that, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a short while. So what Bartels is interested in is actually examining shifts in per capita social spending on things like health, welfare, education, pensions, unemployment, things like that. And what he's doing is looking at changes in spending, and in this case, it's 2 years after each survey. So I pulled this out. This is one of the questions, and I quite like this because it sort of frames people in thinking about, what are the consequences of increasing in government spending? Because, when you ask people, most people say, yes, we want more. We want more spending on health. We want more, better education, better social security. But actually, obviously, the flip side of that is that it might require a tax increase. So the way that the question is framed is to try and sort of frame that in people's minds that, it's not just about wanting better health, better education. It's also kind of considering that in order to do that, then it might cost you in terms of taxes. So I just wanted to pull that out as a sort of neat reminder that framing and the way questions are asked are also super important. And kind of following the results that we've just had a little look at from Gillen's work, we can see that rich people tend to be less enthusiastic than middle and low income people when it comes to increases in social spending, or kind of the desirability of increasing in social spending. And we might think, again, that's quite an intuitive overall finding. So, again, if we've got the starting position where people have differences in their attitudes or preferences for social spending, then there is at least a possibility that these preferences might transfer to policy. So again, we're kind of grappling with that question: do the differences or divergence in views across income groups, how meaningful are they in terms of how likely a policy is to be adopted? And so Bartels sets out on this endeavour with his 30-country study. Now, you don't need to worry too much about this, but just follow the sort of the logic of the setup. So, what we're trying to understand here are the determinants of social spending, and here we're talking about social spending in T+2, so in 2 years' time after the survey was conducted. And now, what Bartels suggests, or at least his model setup suggests, is that this change in social spending is going to be a function of effective demand. So effective demand given various kind of political, economic, other factors. So how much social spending is required or demanded, minus how much spending is actually going on. And of course, policymakers may or may not act in meeting this demand if there is a gap between actual spending and effective demand. And so this lambda here is really a measure of how much the gap between effective demand and actual spending in country I in time t, so how much is this gap actually closing over the 2-year period. A lambda of 1 would indicate that this gap is closed essentially, and it can work in both directions. So obviously effective demand can either be more or less than spending, but if this is 1, it suggests that we've got a closing of the gap between these two things. So I guess the second question then is, what on earth is effective demand according to Larry? So he would say that we've got these factors that determine what our effective demand is for social spending. So the one that we're more interested in is public opinion. So how much social spending do people actually want? And then there are some sort of demographic factors here that might condition the amount of social spending that can be delivered even given public opinion. Oops, let's go back. So public opinion in general, some demographic-y sort of economic factors, and some country fixed effects here. And then the sort of third stage, and this is where we're getting to the nitty-gritty of the essence of the paper, or the kind of the central theme, is that public opinion in country I in time t is going to be determined by high income opinion, so high income earners, what do they think, what are their preferences, plus a low income opinion. And now here, this little parameter, omega, is the most important thing. This is going to be the focus of kind of, or at least a focus for the point that we're trying to make here. So what is this little parameter doing? Well, it represents the sort of relative weight attached to the views of the low-income folks, a sort of low-income influence ratio, if you will, that's capturing the influence of the poorer citizens in each country year relative to the most affluent citizens. So if we think about this parameter as equal to 1, you can think that, okay, well, the opinions of affluent and poor people are equally important in determining the effective demand for social spending. If omega was equal to 0, however, the poorest people have 0, no influence at all. And so, by association, we can think about what that means for the folks that are in between, sort of in the middle of the income distribution too, obviously having a lot less influence than those at the top. So there are lots of different estimations in the paper, lots of different variations of these sort of regressions, but I'm just going to give you the headline results here. So the headline results, on average, this parameter omega is minus 0.86. So what does this mean? So the negative estimate of omega implies, quite remarkably, that low-income citizens' preferences have actually less than no influence on social spending. So what this means is that actually the more support these folks express for social spending, and remember this is relative to rich folks, the less they actually get. So their influence is less than 0. It's less than no influence, which is, quite remarkable. And sort of from a technical point of view, there are lots of different variations that look at different types of economies, different types of countries, so we're trying to accommodate the differences and kind of perhaps different regimes. But the results at least suggest that this parameter, omega, is always negative, regardless of the type of democracy. So whether it's kind of segmented into social, liberal, different types of political institutions, I've put here proportional representation, majoritarian, and likewise for the level of development. So, when subsamples are done on the results, it's showing that there's not really any clustering, so there's nothing that's really driving the overall result. This negative result, this minus result, on average seems to hold. Once again, these are sort of quite interesting but also quite remarkable results. So can we trust them? And I want to kind of bring you back to some of the ideas that we looked at in week 1, and really to emphasise that throughout all of these lectures, always bear in mind those ideas that we looked at as a real foundational building block for how you might critically engage with the ideas that we're presenting over the next few weeks. So can we trust these results? Well, you might go through the similar sorts of arguments as you would with any empirical paper and think about, okay, well, it's likely that there's going to be statistical imprecision of survey data. Is the model specified correctly? Are these variables that are being used good proxies of what we're actually trying to measure conceptually? So, etc., etc. All the types of standard empirical issues that we might encounter with this kind of endeavour. But something I wanted to, really reiterate is remembering these points that were raised in week 1 and when you're thinking about this question. So we might want to unpick some of the analytical or empirical problems, yes, but we might also think about the endeavour, Bartels and Gillen really set out with, is this a pretty futile one if we think about this on ontological grounds? So, of course, there are many dimensions of the political, cultural, institutional and economic variation, that might plausibly affect the relationship between citizens and governments with respect to social spending. So, in Lawson's sort of terms, we might think of these dimensions as inherently open. So trying to measure them sort of in this empirical fashion according to laws, and well, he might have some problems with that if we assume that these dimensions are indeed open. And I guess a final reflective question on this section, on this little segment, is whether the results are actually good enough, at least to be suggestive, if not definitive. So it kind of answers the so what question. So when we're kind of digging into how reliable this data is, don't forget or don't lose sight of that so what question. What are the implications for the argument that we're trying to make? And I'll leave it there for now, and let's move on.